funky fantasy. Do, 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 do. The bowl. Dum, 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 Stratos arrows. Dum, 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 War of Nerds. World building style. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the War of Nerds podcast, and this episode happens to be about world building. And yeah, we actually just got done talking about the intro, how I'm a freak and I do really weird stuff, so I had to get creative for the world building. Anyways, I'm the funky fantasy man, Nathan Helm.
I'm Alfred Muller, also known as the Bold.
And I'm Ryan Morgan, also known as Stratos Arrows.
And we're your nerdy bearded hosts here to bring you excellence and entertainment from the entertainment industry. And tonight's episode is world building. And we're going to metaphorically and literally go around the world talking about this subject. See what I did there? Whoa! Yeah. So, y'all, I think world building is one of those topics when it comes to book writing, not just books, but TV shows, movies, mangas, comics, whatever. I mean, from anything that has to do with creating a universe, world building is one of the foundational things that go into that. So my first question to y'all is, what is the definition of world building to you in a nutshell?
I'll shoot at this first because I kind of had a thought along the lines of that question. And for me, it's when world building comes up, it depends on what you're doing with your series. If it's a standalone book, I feel like it's not that you have no world building, but you're probably not going to scratch the surface of the planning you put into your world building. It's going to be very limited what makes it into the actual book. If you're writing an entire series that's 20 books long, you're probably going to hit 50% of the world building that you really want to hit out of what you write. But again, I don't think you'll ever squeeze every ounce of world building you do outside of what you're writing or shooting as a movie or designing in a game and apply it directly to your work. You're always going to have stuff that just doesn't fit the way you want it to. But for me, world building is everything that makes that world feel real when you're enveloped into the medium, whether it's books, movies, games, manga, any of that stuff. So that's kind of my take on it in the general sense.
Yeah.
Do you want to follow that, Alfred, or should I? Because good Lord,
I'll try and follow it.
Episode over.
Yeah. Dun, da, da, da. Da, 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 da.
I'd have to say, for me, world building is kind of like the foundation of your story. Depending on if you're doing like urban fantasy, there's world building there, epic fantasy, obviously, sci-fi, and it's the little details that really encompass and draw the reader into it. They when they say, "Oh, I fell into a world in a book," or "I fell into a book and I looked up and 12 hours went by," that's world building. That falling into the story and forgetting your reality to enjoy what you have there. And that could be something as simple as a city street in New York, or a plane in Montana somewhere. Just you fall into that, and that's what world building is to me.
Yeah. So I get to basically just pick up the crumbs because there's not much left to explain about it, y'all. But and kind of those were really good, guys. Basically, for me, world building is, there's a lot of people who talk about, you need a foundation for your book or your universe, which you do. Foundation. There's also a lot of people who misinterpret foundation to thinking it means all this technical stuff. And no, not really. Foundation is just like if you build a house, you have to put the slabs and the concrete and stuff, or the basement for the frost line. Well, for a book, I think of world building as figuring out who your characters are, what the universe has, for if it has a rich lore and a rich history. Brandon Sanderson is really good at world building. That's one of his things he's known for. Tolkien was a world builder expert. I think certain genres don't need as much world building as others. When it comes to urban fantasy, there's none better known than the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. And it doesn't start off with a whole bunch of world building. You learn about Harry Dresden. He's a wizard, a retainer for the Chicago PD, and he goes around Sam and Dean Winchester style, looking at these murders and figuring out if a magical creature or something was involved. So you learn about things very, very slowly as the character, as he goes through. Kind of very similar to anime. You learn about things as the episodes go on. So I believe world building is going to be different for every situation, depending on how you want to do it. Kind of how there's hard magic and soft magic, I believe there's hard world building and soft world building, and even hybrid. Is your style, the way that you explain your universe, is going to be different than somebody else's way of doing it. So for me, I focus on my characters, their importance to the story. I figure out their ages, when they were born. Not that that stuff always really matters, but for me, sometimes I need to know that. My magic system, things about the history of the planet or the universe. And then as the book goes on, I explain things and build little chunks here and there and drop little breadcrumbs that will get, Chekhov's gun has to eventually be paid off. So you use that to your world building advantage. But really, world building in a nutshell, you're setting the groundwork that is your universe so that readers have something to grip onto, and then you drop those little surprises. You drizzle the icing on top of the cake, drop the cherry, drop the sparkles, all that stuff as you go on. And so you either do it all at the beginning, which is very slow. Brandon Sanderson kind of does that with the Stormlight Archives. It's all this rich information about the people, light eyes, dark eyes. Even some of that stuff doesn't really get explained until later, but henceforth, you have that style, and then you have the style of the first book is over, and you're still like, what? I want to know. Next book comes along, and you're like, wait, there's another god who's above this god? Okay, all right, we'll go with that. So that's mine kind of spread, and that leads me to a question for you guys. For you, what genres do you believe require less world building, and what ones do you feel like require more? For me, I think anything in the romance, mystery, even urban fantasy, anything that's kind of set in our world, like even Harry Potter didn't have really much world building per se. And I would say basically any of those types of genres. So, romance, supernatural. Sci-fi has world building, but not like fantasy. It's different for fantasy. So I think fantasy requires the most amount of world building, but that's me. So what do you guys think?
I'll go next because it's one of those rare times where we disagree. But I figured I'd point it out because we always agree. I actually think that urban fantasy, while I agree that fantasy takes the majority of world building, I do think that at least the urban fantasy that I write requires a decent amount of world building. For Harry Dresden, you had mentioned him. You have to build how the dynamic is between the hidden world that nobody knows and the real world. So while you don't have to say this is the planet Elder Ring, and we have dwarves and elves, and the race of men started here, blah blah blah. You have, okay, well, I'm Harry Dresden, I'm in a city, but by the way, I'm a wizard, and I'm a wizard like this, not the wizard you may have heard of, and it goes into detail like that. So I do think that urban fantasy requires a decent amount of world building. Again, not to the level of fantasy, just epic or high fantasy, but just traditional world building. Romance, it needs different world building. I think it needs, like,
Yeah.
what are we reading? Are we reading a romantic comedy romance? Are we reading one of those weird, dark, scary romances that exist now? Or are we reading a very spicy romance? Where is the romance level? Because this way I have to know what I'm getting into. And I think that's part of world building too, is introducing the character to the story based on the building blocks you have. But I do agree, romance, murder mystery, noir, uh, 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 stuff like that, based in the real world with real world applications. So you don't have the fantastical or the supernatural or anything like that. Probably less world building, but still enough where you could talk about them in world building.
I retract my statement. It requires world building, but not in the traditional sense of how fantasy uses it. It
Yeah.
has just as much, but it's done in a different way. So it's spread out a lot slower than I think fantasy world building, the general traditional fantasy, epic high, things like that. That is a lot more at the beginning. Whereas you said, the Dresden Files is a lot more spread out. Like we don't even know what the White Council really is,
Yeah, you can get
even
away
within
with
the
a lot
first two
more in those.
books.
You know what I mean? Like you said, with high fantasy, you need to get it out there so they're like, okay, I'm in a city, I know what
Yeah,
I'm doing, what world am I in? Whereas with urban fantasy, you
yeah,
can get away with that because you're in Chicago. We all kind of get what that is.
right. Uh, Ryan?
Ryan?
We're going to war, nerds. We're going to war because I actually think we're gonna have like different takes on this one because
Finally.
nowadays with the way genres like intermingle, like we hard say romance has no world building, but there are romance books out there now that take no place in our common idea of what our world is, and they'll build an entire world to set that setting in. And I think when it comes to world building, we almost group them now into those genres, and we're slowly getting away from that. But I do think there are some parameters to put on it. Like urban fantasy, mine doesn't take place on Earth, but I get the advantage with an urban fantasy of it's a city. Most things operate and have gone through history very similar to Earth. And I spell that out. So there was a classical period, there was a Renaissance period. Like I don't have to explain those things or trickle them in because it's understood that because Earth went through this and our world went through this, you take those things as this is kind of how things went. And you don't have to build that part of your story, which is where the different depths of world building come in. Whereas in a fantasy story where you're creating an entire world and beyond for it, you're going to put a little bit more depth into it. Now that kicks us over to the one we haven't talked about, which is sci-fi. And in sci-fi, it's a very weird system because some people say sci-fi is very low world building because yeah, you have planets, but when you go down to a planet, you get a very general description of the planet. You're on it for a little while, and then you're boom, you're in space again, and you're to another planet that has a very general idea. But you can take that and make it sci-fi fantasy where each world you go to is a world fit for a high fantasy. Now, how much you jam into your book turns it into maybe a Brandon Sanderson book where there's a lot and you have to be a reader that enjoys getting all those details thrown at you. And I'm reading him for the first time recently. I'm listening to it on Audible, so I'm getting my first experiences of Brandon Sanderson right now. And I like parts, and there are parts that I have trouble with, and I won't go into too much of that, but it is a lot thrown at you, but he breaks it up.
Yep.
He doesn't just like line after line throw world building at you, but he does give it in chunks in between significant parts. And then for me, it might be an offhanded comment that one of my characters says to another character that may imply some of that world building that I've thrown into the world. And that's where we'll get into another question. But as a writer, you can get yourself into trouble with that because you fall along that line of, well, these characters should know what the world's like. Why are they explaining the world to each other when they live in it? This was not a real conversation two characters in this world would have.
Yeah.
So, do you guys have anything before I ask my question?
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, just mine's a quick comment. I'm so glad both
Yeah,
of you are
absolutely.
reading Brandon Sanderson because he is my current favorite living author. So
Yeah.
I'm very glad that you guys are diving in.
Mm.
And there's for anybody listening, there are reasons we talk about Brandon Sanderson as much
Mhm.
as we do that we can't disclose why, but hopefully you'll understand later if planets align. Which brings me to my comment to Ryan.
Yeah.
When it comes to sci-fi, I think the options left up to you on how much you
Mhm.
like you were talking about how much you want to world build. So like I've got a sci-fi series called Planet Conquest, and I could do one book for one planet for how many planets there are in the universe. Am I going to do that? No, probably not. But your characters, that's the thing about sci-fi. You've got different characters from different parts of the galaxy. So you can learn about the lore and the culture and the religions and the history of these different places, their character interactions on the ship. And then let's say you go to said characters' home world, Unglobly Zaken Husharala, and some Doctor Who-ish type name planet, that you can't pronounce. And, this little like alien character's just like, ah, yes, welcome to my home planet. No one here speaks the common tongue, so I'll have to translate everything for you. The air is toxic, by the way. We just stepped off the ship. Are we going to 5 people like pass out? It's like, you didn't think about telling us that before we got off the ship? Oh, yes, sorry about that. Yes. I thought you said you were a higher intelligence life form. We are. I guess I assumed too much of the human race. You did. So yeah, I think that's a cool part about sci-fi, science fantasy, space opera. You get those opportunities to choose what you want to do, like Star Wars as a prime example. How much do we actually learn about all the planets that they go to, right? Like,
Nothing really.
Very little.
I mean, besides Tatooine, we learned too much about Tatooine. Go somewhere else, okay? Naboo, Mandalore, Mustafar. Mustafar is a cool planet, but we really don't learn much about the Outer Reach. Anyways,
Alderaan.
Yeah, I mean,
boom.
that's it. It
You
explodes
may
really nicely.
fire when ready.
I did want to say though, based on the definitions we said in the beginning, like I do think sci-fi has a substantial amount because it's not necessarily the world you're learning about, it's science and physics and those kinds of elements in their world building that determine what you're dealing with. Because like, do they have warp technology or hyperspace? Do they use lasers or light swords? Do they have guns that shoot bullets? Do they shoot something else? So it's not necessarily the world that's building, it's the reality that's building. What are we in? Are we in a video game? Are we in a virtual reality? So it's
Yeah.
I do agree that it's different world building, but I do think there's enough of needing to teach the readers.
And you're absolutely right there, because I mean, even in fantasy and urban fantasy and romance and everything, if you're creating systems like Nathan and I've talked about this, about like the economic system of a story, it's probably unnecessary. Some people may want to know it, some people don't. But if you buy a duck and it costs 10 gold coins, and you buy a lord's mansion and it costs 10 gold coins, there's something wrong in your story that people are going to question. So that consistency has to be there, or some believability. But there are writers out there where they travel from this city to this city, and they will painstakingly look how long it takes for a weighted down horse to travel that distance. And other writers will say, I don't talk about time. I don't say how many days it took. They went on this journey. They either slept at night or they didn't, and time passed, and then they arrived. When you start getting into those little tiny details, there are the neckbeards, and I know we're all bearded, but the neckbeards out there that will truly pick apart your story little by little. And like, that's not what it's for. The story is not about those little details, but those little details do draw you into the story and keep you there. But they can also push you out of it when they're not realistic, or when they like are inconsistent, and you're like, wait a minute, I have to go back 5 chapters because this doesn't sound right anymore. So
I've got 2 things to add to
absolutely.
that. You're late. Late. The wizard arrives precisely. A wizard is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to. And then as economics go, toss a coin to your witcher, a valley of plenty. That is the only economics that has anything of importance to the witcher. So I really like, there are people who are like, you need an economic system. No, not really. Unless it has something really important to do with your story that impacts it, like you're a bounty hunter and you're getting paid ransoms or salaries from a king or a captain or whatever due to your task. Cool. You win. You're paid 500, gold tegars to bring in this, murderer or rapist or whatever It is Assassin's Creed style. They're like, congratulations, you've completed your mission. Here's your 500 gold coin reward. And you look at your inventory. Okay, 500 gold coins is equivalent to a horse. All right, well, now you know 500 gold coins is equivalent to a horse. I think, honestly, economics plays more into video games than it does into books, if I'm
Yeah.
going
That
to
are
be honest.
RPGs.
Yeah, just because I
Yeah,
mean, most of the time in especially fantasy, you're dealing with rich lords and the understanding of how much money they actually had compared to the regular everyday people. It didn't
yeah,
matter how much money they had. They could tell you whatever, and you just like, yep, that's right. And like Ryan, like you said, the only time where that actually plays in is if your character is like, okay, I'm a young serf who's trying to become a knight, so I take these tasks and I'm earning money and I'm saving up, but all that matters is what is the goal price. It doesn't,
Mhm.
well, I have to buy food for the week, so I'm having to deduct that every single time, but no one cares, and at least not many people care. So,
I'm writing the
excuse me,
next.
sir. I'm looking for a blouse. I need 10 silver coins. In order to get these silver coins, you must chop down said tree in the Garden of Oaks. Bring back the tree when you are finished with your task, and the 10 silver coins will be awarded to you as such.
I feel like we've talked about Robin Hood before, but I am definitely going to write the next Sherwood Forest tax law book and make it a fantasy now.
Do
the
that,
story
and
told
I'll
from the
do a lit
sheriff of Nottingham's
RPG.
perspective. Oh,
You
so
do you
to
do
the
that, I'll do a lit RPG with a Robin Hood type character in there.
There
to
you
the
go.
lit,
Hey,
but Ryan, I
Robin,
hope you remember
I'm
your question.
Loxley.
I got it still. Don't worry.
Okay, good.
He gave me money when I was in need. Robin Hood of Loxley.
But yeah, I'll go into my question here in a second, but just to touch on what jumping into that the economics thing, and like it's not necessary unless you make it necessary. But again, we could be talking to people who are writing like the next TTRPG or like Dungeons and Dragons campaigns where that stuff is more necessary because you need to know what the difference is for your characters buying this versus some outrageous thing that they're trying the whole campaign to afford, and it can't be the same because I've made my own homebrew games before, and then like my system was broke within the first session, and like that's because you don't think those things out. But there are brilliant people who, when they're working on this, they build that stuff into their world. And like DMs are, I got to give them a lot of credit because they do what us writers do to a greater degree because they'll write an entire campaign. They want to steer you into a certain direction. They want to give you all this stuff that you can do, and you'll touch 2% of it and go off into this other place. And they're like, but the 98% I had, all right, we're going this way. Let's go. But to bring us my question, I'm sure we'll touch on at the end, like how we do a little bit of our own world building, how we sprinkled in, or if we throw it all at the reader. But what in reading or watching a movie or something you've done, what takes you out of the story as far as world building goes and something that you've experienced for you guys?
I'll hit that
All right.
unless you've got it on tip of your tongue. Um,
You're good.
you talk about like you're listening to an audiobook or reading the story and you feel your eyes glaze over, like you're brought out of the story, right?
Yeah,
The
something that
experience.
kills the story for you that isn't just the characters. It's something about the world that all of a sudden just breaks your realism or connection to that world.
So for me, something that will break my momentum of enjoyment is you're in a scene where the characters are doing something specifically, and all of a sudden it goes off for 10 pages about some backstory lore out of nowhere. It's not naturally thrown in through conversation of dialogue or anything like this. It's just like said character sees a sign on the wall and they're just like, oh my, I remember 50 years back when my great great grandfather got this trophy on the wall, and the importance of it to Dosmelia is because of this. 10 pages later, and really honestly, there are so many of these in the castle that and by that point in time I've already like switched to another audiobook because I'm so incredibly bored. I'm like, y'all were just making your way toward, Devil's Canyon, and then you went off about, I don't care about that. Better yet, get on your way to Devil's Canyon and talk about it in dialogue, character conversation, have people ask questions about this. So like hey, you're already walking down, the fields on your way to your destination, character, like that thing you saw that you were mentioning earlier, like what is it? You're like, oh, I'm so glad that you asked. You see, Andres Media, that thing is important for one reason specifically. It is said that it is a portal to another world, but it is not proven yet. The character's like, wait, really? That was a portal to another world? Well, my great-great-grandfather sure thought so, and he disappeared. It didn't come back for 10 years, so I don't know. Like things like that I enjoy because now, ooh, you're interested about this thing. Maybe it's a portal. Character, your main protagonist is asking questions. And when you're done with said conversation, guess what? Oh, look at that. Devil's Canyon. And you've made it to your destination. And now,
Yep.
boom, you're on your next part. And it flows nicely. You're not jerked out of the story because of like, no offense to any of the Stephen King readers out there, but that's some Stephen King crap. Talk about red window curtains for 10 pages. No, show me a ghost, bro. All right, I don't care.
So there's
That's me.
two examples for me, and I agree, Nathan. Like that kills it for me unless I can see where that's connected. Like if it's an internal monologue that really plays to character development, I don't mind that. If it's expounding on the world and I can see, and Brandon Sanderson does this great, where he does exposition, but it's character driven. And it's just that I think is well done. But I agree that if it's just like out of the blue and random, I'm like, what's going on? The two examples, one, sorry for those who love the series, I couldn't continue on, but eventually I might. The Grishaverse, Shadow and Bone.
Never heard of
The
it.
Yeah, no, me neither.
it's maybe a Six of Crows is the duology that came afterwards. But anyway, in it there's these sorceresses are kind of there, and they have magic powers. And in one of the opening chapters, like the first little bit, you see one of these gypsy magic users, and I apologize, I believe that's a negative term. So the magic users go up to a noble, and they've described for the first portion of this story how powerful these sorceresses are. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm in a world, magic rules. In everything I've ever read, magic users tend to be powerful, and the way they describe them, they weren't subservient. They weren't meek. They were powerful, and they showed their power. Especially because it had a very heavy-handed world building in the beginning, where it was like this creature called the Darkling is the strongest magic user in all of existence, and he can destroy people. And there's this magic veil that he created. Blah blah blah. Next thing I know, a lord is berating this sorceress and making her subservient. And the next line is like, they bow down to the royalty, and never explains why. And I'm like, the contradiction threw me out of the story and set a very poor tone and left a sour taste in my mouth for the rest of the story, so that I noticed every little contradiction, because it's a romantasy, and it's a romance masquerading as a fantasy. I won't even give it a romantasy title. It's romance in a fantasy world, and for that, the world building fell apart. It was very weak. It was just there to further the romance. And when you're doing that, for someone who reads fantasy so often, that killed me, because I was like, it's not making sense. It's only there for plot, and I picked up on those things. The other one, I don't remember the name of it, but it was like Dinosaur Lords or something. It was a Game of Thrones style fantasy where instead of horses, they rode dinosaurs. But it was, we're sitting in a cart and we're driving along, and oh look, I look to the left and there is a dragonfly sized dinosaur flying by. Or, we're in the middle of a conversation, he looks over, a triceratops is sticking its nose in the water to drink. I'm like, you wouldn't have stopped the story or dialogue to say a deer is drinking from the water, or I saw cows on the side of the road. Like the author trying to hit you in the head with, there's dinosaurs in my book, there's dinosaurs in my book, pay attention to the dinosaurs. It was just like, what? I can't deal with this. Like, just write and be like, okay, like again, Brandon Sanderson, he has crab creatures and these other beings that aren't horses. But he doesn't say, oh, by the way, look, it's grazing over there. Oh, by the way, look at it over there. It's just, we're in a wagon, we're being pulled by triceratops. That's all I need to know. I don't need to know that there's dinosaurs all around me. You're being pulled by triceratops. The book cover is a dinosaur. I get there's dinosaurs. Stop trying to hit me in the head with it. But that's a long-winded way of saying those two things: contradictions and beating me in the head with something you find unique to your world.
As Jimmy and Linda moved their way through the fields, being carried by their triceratops, they looked to their left and realized two T-Rexes were galloping along, frantically playing with one another, viciously with their teeth. Flying through the air were Dalodactyl monsteruskis, which was a made-up dinosaur that could fly through the air, which was hybrid breeded through the last 1,000 years of dinosaurs. And as Jimmy looked to his love of his life, Linda, he realized a couple triceratopses were munching on some delicious-looking things over there. We get it. There's
That was better.
dinosaurs.
That 2 seconds of you coming up of improv was better than that entire book. Because it wasn't even detail. It was just mentioning that there were dinosaurs.
Yep. And again, like
Please.
what you said there sounded like a transition between scenes or dialogue, as opposed to just abruptly stopping your dialogue and being like, "Oh, look over there. What was I talking about again?" And then going back to it.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Steve Irwin came into my mind. Oi, look over there. Oh, it's a king cobra. Most venomous snake in all the planet. One bite of its fangs and I'm gonna poke it with a stick. Like, that's more entertaining than the book stuff. It's like, oi, look, it's a dinosaur. Yeah,
But what about
no,
you, Ryan?
seriously.
What kicks you out?
So for me, it's the statements like, or don't you remember, when you're trying to explain to the reader something and you're like, oh, don't you remember from school that gravity holds us on the planet? And it's where, like, obviously those two characters would never have that conversation because it's understood that happens in this book. Like, it should be understand for those people that live on the world. But like the reverse of that I think works really well is when you have a character that isn't exposed to it, like Harry Potter. Harry comes to the magic world at a very late age. He wasn't raised knowing most of what all the young wizards and witches know growing up. Even before they learn magic, they're exposed to that world and they know all these little details, and then there's what they learn in school, whereas he has to catch up. So they're like, oh, of course you don't know this, you never got exposed to this, here's what happens. And that makes more sense having that. But when someone's just like, oh, it's because of this, and they're like, oh, duh, I know that. Well, yeah, you should have. Why did you even have this conversation? Like that just, and it happens in movies too and games, and I'm just like, you got to assume that your reader can make some jumps on their own. Like with the dinosaur book, like dinosaurs on the cover, Triceratops is pulling the wagon. It's understood you're going to see dinosaurs in the wild. Now, if you get a specific scene where you're like, this one dangerous dinosaur is following us closely on the side, and every once in a while it keeps getting closer, that's a different thing than, oh, let me remind you, there's a dinosaur over there, because there's dinosaurs everywhere. So,
Well,
I mean,
to
that one
that
always
point
draws
too,
me out.
to that point too, though, J.K. Rowling does it wonderfully because it's not, oh, by the way, Harry, this is blah 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 blah. It's you see it through like action. So like Hermione and Ron may be doing something, and Harry's like, "What the heck is going on?" Oh, that's right. A great example is the parcel tongue. Like Harry just thinks, "Oh, everybody can do this," and they're like, "No, that's not good." And you see it like, oh, conflict, problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's more interesting than just, hey, by the way, Harry, you probably shouldn't be talking like that because not many people do that in the middle of
Yeah,
everybody.
Yeah, Harry's
absolutely.
literally like, I'm sure loads of people can talk to snakes. No, they can't. And to what you said, Ryan, about the, do you remember World War II and the German tanks? Yes, yes, we remember. Well, with my characters, I have certain characters that are basically the lore of my universe. And so with my protagonist, well, he lived in Taronia till he was 8, but then he was jacked away from his world and sent to the future. No spoilers here from my universe. You have to read it to find out. Haha. But he's 8 years there. So when he gets back, he doesn't know anything about, like, besides the general history of Teronia, he doesn't know about some of the other stuff that happened with wars and characters. So Zylok will from time to time be like, while my protagonist is around, he's talking to another character and be like, do you remember when we fought together against such and such? Like, oh yes, that brings back some good memories. And Eliath will be like, wait, who, what? And be like, oh yes, a story for another time. Like, no, I want to know right now.
But
Nope,
see, that's a
later.
better use, in my opinion. Like, I think you do that way better than the like subtle info drops where they're just like, oh, we need to make this a known fact, but I have no creative way to do it. Whereas yours is like a retelling or informing the character that missed out on that, and I like that much better.
And not just that,
That's
but it goes
yeah.
it goes to character as well. Like how many times, I mean, I know me, I have numerous times been like, did I tell you this story already? Or you have a character who's been through many wars, has been through many fights. Were we in that fight together? I know we fought together like 20 times, but were you in this fight? Do you remember that detail? Or if you're talking to your buddies after a 3-year campaign, D&D campaign, you're like, do you remember when we played that session? That makes sense because it's a memory of a specific moment that no
Yes.
one may
Yeah.
remember. It's not, do you remember World War II? Yes, I remember a world war that influenced the entire world. Uh, it's stuff like that.
World
Or
history,
did you
bro.
know that we have to breathe every few minutes? Like we can't just like stop breathing. We have to keep breathing. Like
What's
yeah,
oxygen? Um,
that would I would walk away from that person. I'd be like, okay,
I
but yeah,
really
that
think
that kills me.
it's it's fun to do retellings. Like
Mhm.
characters, you're teaching your reader about this information for one. But they're like, well, shouldn't your protagonist already know about this? No, this was from way before his time. 1, 2, this is a secretive character who's revealing this information, a mysterious character. And 3, even if the said character did remember, he was away from his world for 8 years and he might have forgotten and he might be getting the extended version. So I think it's fun to do stuff like that. And that kind of brings me to my next question. And I'm curious for you guys, what do you find is the most enjoyable part of world building for you with your own universes that you've had fun doing?
Surprising myself.
Yeah, it's a good
So
answer.
if I'm writing and I'm like, okay, I'm working on world building stuff. So I have the world building stuff over here on paper or in my head, and then I'm writing a story, and I'm like, oh my God, bam. And there may be like a 10-year gap or some type of missing link in my backstory world building stuff that doesn't matter at the time, but I'm sitting there and I'm writing, and I'm like, that's what can go there. And all of a sudden it finds its way into the story and connects dots and creates more of a world, a continuity that was lacking prior, and I find sources to add in, or if I'm stumped on dialogue or something, some type of event can occur from the previous backstory that I didn't have, but it just kind of
Yeah,
clicks like that makes sense. This would be great.
awesome. How about you, Ryan?
Uh, this is tough.
If
I
you want to
think
think about it longer, I can go.
go ahead and then I'll go in.
Okay. For me, it's tethering those strings to have them spread out. You learn about something and then it's in your subconscious. May only be said once or twice. I like to drop sprinkles. Shoot those strings outward and have them connect later to where somebody's just like, it's a reveal and you're like, what just happened? Whoa. Oh, and they go scroll back and they're just like, oh my gosh, he only said it once or twice. And now it's like, what? Like, I like doing stuff like that, like huge plot reveals or plot twists, which by the way, different from most pantsers, I don't pants my plot twists. My plot twists are actually happen to all be planned, believe it or
Mhm.
not.
Cool.
Yeah, ironically. But yeah,
I
that's
envy
my
that.
favorite part of world building is reveals, dropping the mic. That's my favorite part.
So I think for my current one, like I love series, which is why I get stuck world building sometimes. I know a lot of people say like world building is the crutch in which you don't actually write because you're too busy continuously building a world and never actually writing the story. But
Yep.
I love making a lot of the details that will eventually come out because I do like writing these bigger series like beyond trilogies. And like the current one I'm writing right now, they're all standalone books. Characters go from book to book, but each book you don't have to read the one before it. They'll like throw back oh, when we did this, but it's not such an important detail where you're like, oh, I have to go read that. But it's like, oh, I kind of want to know what happened in that story. Maybe I'll go read that one sometime. But each book stands on its own. So I want my world building like I have a guild system. Each magic belongs to a guild. So when you talk about a guild, there's like a mindset of that guild. Like the Phoenix Guild used to be, they're all fire magic users. So everyone thinks of them as this destructive force way back in their beginning. And then they went through a rebirth, like a phoenix. Oh, there's a spoiler for you. And now they're a very like calm, collected. You can forge through fire as opposed to just destroy with it. So when you meet a person from that guild, you have like a stereotype or an expectation going into it. Now that character can either like subvert that stereotype or fall into it, and that will take the reader in one of two different paths. But every time you come across one of those characters, you have a mindset before you even meet that character of what they are through that world building. So right now I just think just implanting those broader ideas of what each group is, and then that individual character also has their own identity apart from that when you cross them type things. I mean, for me, I
Like
think
that.
that right now is my biggest like world building thing.
I like that.
That's cool.
See, for
I
me,
hope
that
so,
that
but
reminds
we'll see.
me that reminds me of Game of Thrones, and
Mhm.
I guess it's not spoilers because most of the world has seen the show, but just in case you haven't, at the end of the final written book, Jon Snow is stabbed to death, and everyone was like, oh my God, he's got to come back, he's got to come back, and it's a hopeful got to come back because Martin is known for killing off characters you love, and you
Mhm.
almost, as I think Nathan, you mentioned this as almost to a fault, he's done that. Uh, but with the show, it finally happened, and you have a main character that actually came back and survived one of those major death points. And those reveals, or in a loose way, fitting into a stereotype as far as like an author goes, he's going to kill this character, we're never going to see him again, but they come
Mhm.
back. It's subverting that, and it's world building where it's like, oh, so this actually does work. Because I don't think
Mhm.
you, maybe once or twice you've seen on page that Beric Dondarrion has raised someone from the dead, but I think most of the time it's kind of, with the exception of Lady Stoneheart, it's kind of like loosely alluded to, but you don't actually see it, and it's hinted at, and there's wishy-washiness that could go one way or the other. But that was like the first time you saw a main character come back, and you learned
Yep.
about the world that way.
Well, remember, it wasn't Beric Dondarrion who brought people back. He had his priest who brought him back multiple times, and he was brought back by the Lord of Light. But Beric
Yeah.
himself never did that. That was it was something that was really cool about Beric's character. Is you learn like this dude had been brought back 6 or 7 times, and so that you see that and you're like, oh, maybe there's hope for other characters. And then Melisandre comes and does the whole thing with Jon Snow, and he's like, the Lord of Light has plans for him. Oh, really? Does he now? That's great.
Mhm.
Again, who's the Lord of Light? Um, anyways, so this is kind of a question about series as a whole. World building. What is y'all's favorite series that you've read, listened to, or whatnot with because of world building? What was your favorite world building series that you've read, listened to, or whatnot?
Is this like if I got isekai'd into a world, it's a world I would want to be a part of, or
No, no, no. Something that you've read that you loved the world building so much that it just made it a memorable experience for you. So, a series that did world building very well, your favorite series due
okay.
to
I'm
world building.
I'm gonna go off the beat. I'm not gonna use a top main guy because again, I've already gushed over Brandon Sanderson enough. I will say there's two series. One of them is Helldivers on Audible, and not the video game. This is a book, which is a very similar book. So I don't know if they played off of one another or what. But it's called Helldivers, and basically it's after World War III. The basically Avenger style aircraft are flying around the world trying to hunt down different, for lack of a better, like nuclear plant powers to fuel the ships. But just the world building that's done, because it's a post-apocalyptic, but all the little things that they do so well has made me come back to the series. The story's interesting, but I go to learn more about the world, and that's why I listen to the book. The other
Cool.
one was Peter V. Brett's Demon Cycle, and that was a fantasy, which I do like fantasies where you can't tell, is it post-apocalyptic or is it in the past, or is it because we've lost all that, we're in the future, but we're like we're in the past. So learning about his world and trying to figure out which one it is, I've enjoyed.
Oh, this is a tough one, man. You're hitting us with the hard questions today, Nathan. I love it.
It's okay. I'll give you a few more seconds. I'll name mine while you're
Okay.
thinking. So for me, it's world building goes, and it's a little bit probably, big shocker here. You probably could have guessed, but Lord of the Rings is one. Um, and I think the Lord of the Rings universe was done so beautifully. It was crafted, and it leaves you wanting to know more. It left you with that openness to learn more about the universe, and then Tolkien put out the Silmarillion and the Tales of Middle Earth, and you could just go deep dive on lore, and that was really cool. And then also for world building, another one of my favorites is not just the books but the video game as well, Halo. I love getting to deep dive about John, Master Chief, his story about becoming part of the Spartan program, being selected when he was a child by Dr. Halsey, learning about the Mjolnir armor and just everything that goes into what they do to these kids to train them to be Spartans. And it's just about the world and the history of the Covenant and the military and the Halo rings. And oh man, it's mind blowing, dude. Like the Halo universe is so cool. And when you actually like get deep into the lore, oh yeah, yeah. So there you go.
So it's maybe a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I honestly think it's kind of Star Wars for me. And I know it's a big franchise, but just so much of what they built into the Republic, the Galactic Wars, going back to the old Republic, and then everything that's gone through there, there's so much that I want to know more about. And we talked about this before with like Revan, and I had to go back and actually like listen to the Audible book of Revan because I fell in love with this character in the Old Republic game series and like just the lore about him. And I was like, man, I need to know more about this guy. And so Star Wars has always been the one where like there will be a side character and I am drawn to that. And it's more characters than world building, but it goes into all these people make up the world of Star Wars. And they draw me into, well, I want to know about that planet. I want to know about the Wookiees. I want to know about this Jedi. And like he was only in this one movie, but like he had an entire existence outside of it. And that one probably draws me in the most as far as like going beyond and wanting to know more of it. So
That's not a cop out. I
I
mean,
wish you wouldn't
how
have.
many people? I'm sorry, I was just gonna say how many people were so upset when Disney said, "Yeah, no, all those books that everybody loved don't count anymore." Like that was all such rich lore that people loved. So I don't think it's a cop out. It's an honest answer.
yeah, I also think there's like the mindset of how much world building is actually in Star Wars, where it is more about the characters and the story than less about the world building. So like that's where I characters draw me in more than the world itself. So maybe that's why it's hard for me to answer specifically on the world building or like to pick one series, but I'm drawn more to the character side of it. What were you gonna say, Nathan?
Okay.
I was just gonna say Star Wars is 100% character driven as a story, and that's where you attach to certain characters and you follow them along. You want to know about their lore, about their like you're talking about Revan.
Mhm.
Not to say Star Wars is one of my favorite when it comes to to world building too, just because of the characters in the Old Republic. I don't care about the High Republic so much. Meh. It's meh. The Old Republic is where it's at. All right, that's where the cool stuff is. The most sickest of sick villains and heroes come from the Old Republic. Everybody's just gonna be like, but what about Luke? I mean, yeah, Luke's awesome, but y'all gotta go really delve deep into the Old Republic, or go play KOTOR, or go play Jedi Knight Academy, or some of the old Star Wars games, but with like, Star Killer and different stuff. Star Wars is, it's just flat out awesome. And
Mhm.
that brings me to my last question for this episode, because we're getting close to that time marker. And if you guys have any more questions after that, feel free. But and actually, Ryan kind of already touched on it. But based on world building, if you had the opportunity to jump into any universe because of the world building, which one would you jump into? And you only get one. You don't get more than one.
I would have to go with the time I was reincarnated as a slime if I could have it happen the same way.
Okay.
I really enjoyed the world they built and how the different monsters have and different factions have their own little areas, and they're starting to fight for the same areas and then work together, build alliances. Like, I just like the world they built in that one. So if I jumped into one, it'd probably be that one.
Narnia for me. I think Narnia is one of the coolest worlds ever. And if I could dive into there and be a part of that world, just learn about what more. There's so much more you could learn about Narnia. So I would love to dive in there and see all the fantastical creatures and meet Aslan, and maybe learn what different types of magics and stuff, and just explore a whole nother world. I've always was just fascinated with Narnia. So that's me.
This is probably the hardest question you guys have ever asked me on this podcast, because I mean, I see it.
There can only be one.
I know, and I see the stuff on like TikTok where they're like, "Oh, what world would you want to live in?" Or "What was the last book you lit?" All this stuff, and I'm just like, I don't know, because I love all these different worlds. But similar, Ryan, I like the characters in the story. But I'm gonna say Digimon, just because I always loved going to a digital world, having a cool little companion friend who could digivolve and fight off the dark creatures and all that. So I'm gonna say Digimon.
It's a good answer.
You know what? No, I changed my mind. One Piece.
No, you only get one. You only get one.
God dang it. But obviously, we all would want to live in our own book universes if we could.
Yeah.
The ones that we create. Automatically, that is just an answer. That is just a given for us, because
Nope.
No,
we're already
Ryan,
living
listen, what
inside of our
it is.
universes. Hey. No, sir. No, sir. I'm no, yeah, that's fair.
Some dark stuff happens in my world. Not to my characters necessarily, but like depends
parts
who
of
I
the
am
world.
in my world. So
Have you seen the real world that we live in?
that is true. It's
Just
kind of why
saying.
that's kind of why dystopian fiction has fallen off, because people are like, I don't want to escape to a shitty world. I already live in a bad one.
That's fair.
So
But
I think Ryan had hinted at this question earlier, and I haven't asked
yeah,
one yet, so I'm going to steal it.
do it.
What world building tools do you guys use?
Go ahead.
Yeah, hit it, Ryan. No,
Okay.
you go.
I was just gonna say I love the subtle little drops. Like, obviously, like if I'm introing in a chapter, I might like set the scene a little bit of like where they're at and kind of build in some there. But I like where it comes out naturally in dialogue, where like you're in a fight and the two characters stop and they'd be like, "Oh, I see that you studied in the so and so style of fighting," and like little tiny hints there where you're not going into which uses this to deflect my opponent's this necessarily, but like just a subtle dropping in of that, which there's nothing wrong with expanding upon it depending how you do it, but I like those little subtle things, like Back to the Future 3, the Clayton Ravine, like the it's just a one line, oh, that must have been how it got its name, and like just that one thing, and it ties you back to in the future where he comes from and understanding that. And you don't get that till her name is said, and like just that little subtle drop, and it connects the dots, like what you were talking about with those strings that you have out there, and then they all connect at one point, and you get this little tidbit of information, but it connects a bunch of things together. So like I try to do that, but I do think I'm still learning when it comes to how effectively I build my world building into my books, because they are shorter. Like I write 80,000 word books as opposed to 100 and something thousand, where you do get more space to word build.
So for me, picture a star chart, right? Take a piece of paper, little circles on it, and lines that go across. That's what I draw for my books. And I start with the main circle, the first circle, and I just put character name or a part in the story that happens. And then when those strings spread out, I put my plot points of plot turns, reveals, important things that happen. And I use that as kind of a tool metric so that when I'm in my book, things happen. I see, oh, I'm at this point in the story. I'm at this circle. I'm going to have a character talk about something through dialogue to reveal something about the story, whatever I have written down at that point. I just follow my little string chart on a piece of paper to make sure that I'm following my little important points that I want to touch on. So that's a tool that I use when I'm just making sure I'm touching. And that also helps me to not drop too much in a clumped up little spot and not just like drag people down with information overload. I don't want to make people's brains explode. I want them to be able to soak in the information, and I want to just enough to leave them wanting more till I get to my next circle. And then boom, I connect those strings so that he brings up, you remember when I was talking to you about that? That leads us to this training exercise, and this is how it works. Boom. He's like, you got to see me do it before. Now I'm going to explain how it works. So you see something happen with no explanation, except maybe a name of a spell or a move. And then a little bit later, it gets explained, and maybe a little bit about lore and things like that. That's my favorite thing to do as a tool for world building. It's just a little string diagram to help me kind of just swim the waters. So
I like
That's
that. And
awesome.
we're gonna have to throw that Charlie Day meme of all the conspiracy dots connecting.
Yeah, because that's amazing that you can do that. Because I was getting boggled by just thinking about how you could plan that out and think of all those things. Because I'm as pantser as it gets. I just write in the editing process. I'm like, ooh, that was too much. Let me cut some of that back. Or, ooh, there wasn't enough there. I got to add this. And I just go by the seat of my pants on that type of stuff. But I'd say my favorite. I use a multitude of tools. I use dialogue because I think it's one of the easier ones. It's also one of the most fluid ones. It works really well when done well. It but I also use, because I deal with like different realms. So you go to hell, you go to heaven, you go to purgatory in my world. So I use like almost archaeological kind of things. So in one part, they discover a pictogram that's drawn, and they're sitting there, and there is dialogue, but it's almost like discovery, like trying to work out what is going on. So there's some exposition there as the character's thinking, and they're putting pieces together in something that they don't know about. Or I'll use tomes and books that they're reading as they're thinking about, they're putting the pieces together as they're reading that. Uh, and then I do use some exposition, a la Brandon Sanderson and the greats before me. But those are the multitude of tools I use.
And I still need to start your book. I got to finish the other one. Reading is not my
Hey,
strong point. I got to, because I switched to Audible because of that. But
yeah,
in reading some of the chapters Nathan sent me, I think you use a lot of internal thought too, not just straight
hmm
dialogue. When you drop some of your world building in just like that internal thought as well.
that's one of the ones I love.
I
I think
I
do.
you do
love
it.
it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm full anime style when it comes to that. I like to drop a lot of stuff, internal thought for that character. He's just like, am I going to be able to succeed doing that? Like, there's got to be a way. I've seen the old man do it. Like, I'll never stop until I get it done.
Mm.
And just their thought process. So when you're diving into their brain, because you're not in first person POV, right? In
Mhm.
third person POV, you got to use internal dialogue. And there's a lot of people who are just like, that's too much internal dialogue for a third person. Okay, for you maybe, but I like you to. That's why I write multi-character POV, and I'll add to you, Alfred, dialogue and using like artifacts and different things like books or tools or weapons or things that are like, enchanted or like holy artifacts or like, I have an object called the Divine Sword, which was created by Divine Infinity himself with cosmic magic. And the sword can literally absorb magical attacks and send them back tenfold. It's like the sword from the Legend of Zelda almost. But having things like that are cool, they're like you need your character to have tools like that, but you want them to not have to rely on them. So I think it's cool to have them as a part of history, but also as part of a character's journey. It's
Mhm.
just like in Skyrim, you could literally spend hours upon hours just going and reading the books throughout the Skyrim world and learning about the universe. So I think it's cool to have those. You make a mark about it in the book, like, hey, this book is a old scroll from the days of the priests, right? And then you come out with a companion novel that's all chalked together as like an encyclopedia of lore for your universe. Um, it's something I'm kind of excited to do. Is at the end of each of my books, I'm going to have what's called Xylok's Journal. I'm not going to call it syllabus because it would be called Xylok's Journal because he's the character who would do this type of thing, take notes, write in his journal. And it'll have each of the main characters from said book, their status, deceased or alive, any special tools or artifacts they may have, what their main form of magic is that they use, and their age. And just something cool for like the super nerds to be able to follow along with stuff like that. People who maybe can't follow along as well, and they have a little thing to just kind of check back when they start the next book. And I don't know, I find it fun to do. And then at the end, when all is said and done, when the series ends, it's a little section from Xylok's journal being like, watching all of these things that occurred over the last certain years has been an experience I never thought I would have gotten in my life. And as I close the next chapter, the next one begins. Boom. And it'll actually say the end. Like just doing things like that is just like woof. It gives you
I love it.
goosebumps, man.
I I'll sometimes, if I'm too much in my head and I'm too much world building, I'll just open a different document or one of the world building tools I have, like Campfire Pro, and I'll just type out everything textbook style. This way, I feel like I've gotten it all out of my system, and then I'll pick and choose what I actually need for this specific scene, and then I'll leave the rest that may or may not ever get explained, but just the bits that I think are actually useful, I'll throw in, and then the rest is for me.
And
Absolutely.
anybody who's listening to this, please drop in the comments on Spotify or YouTube. If you're a writer or a creator, what do you like about world building? What's a tool maybe you use for your own process or things that you've found along your journey that really just stick with you that you love when it comes to world building? Um, do you it's vital to a story, obviously, but I don't know. What do you guys think? You got any other, final remarks or questions or anything that
I
you
was
can
just
think
gonna
of?
say, with the D&D thing, we'll get in, I'm sure we'll do an entire episode on D&D, but that type of world building is probably the most in-depth, and I know what you mean, Ryan. Like, I've run campaigns where I'm like, all right, I got all this information, and they go off on a tangent, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm going off the cuff now because I have nothing planned for this. Let's see what happens. And those are some of the funnest sessions, but
Oh yeah.
it's so disheartening because you're like, I spent 3 weeks on this one town and creating every possible aspect, and they could care less about the town, and they want to go follow a cart full of dirt because they think there's a vampire in it. And you're like, it was manure, guys. There's nothing in it. By the time the session was over, there was something in it, but originally it was just a cart full of dirt.
They're like, I knew it. I knew
Yeah.
something was in it. No,
But
But
no,
I that's all I got. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of our hour of time. Y'all, we will have some episodes that go over an hour, but generally we try to keep them around that ballpark. So, hey, thanks for sticking with your birded. I was going to say birded. The
Could be
type of
birded.
eagle, an eagle nerd or a hawk nerd. But anyways, thanks for listening to our world building episode, and until next time, I've been the funky fantasy man, Nathan Helm.
Alfred Muller.
And Ryan Morgan, also known as Stratos Eros.
And we hope you have a world building night. Till next time.